All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining our final City Forum talk for the semester. City Forum, as most of you know, is... Oh, Miriam wants to say hi. Hey,
Hi, Miriam.
Um, so as most folks here know, City Forum is our biweekly seminar series hosted by the Community and Regional Planning graduate program in the School of Architecture. Today, we're super excited to have Jesus Barajas here giving our seminar. So Jesus is an assistant professor in environmental science and policy and in the Institute of Transportation Studies, which is my alma mater, at UC Davis. His research addresses how systems of inequalities influence travel behavior, and he helps us think through how policymakers can and should respond. In my mind, Jesus is one of the rare scholars that can deftly combine qualitative and quantitative methods to shed new light on longstanding problems. I'm really a huge fan of Jesus's work. Quick look at his CV shows a number of high impact papers on a wide range of transportation topics that address various questions related to transportation equity and mobility justice. So Jesus's worked on issues related to immigrant travel behavior, ride hailing and ride sharing equity, Latino placemaking. He has lots of work on cycling and its interactions with race and ethnicity. Also work on public transit use and perceptions among immigrants. So he's really helping us understand more about kind of the key issues related to transportation equity and mobility justice. We're super excited that he's here today to speak with us about his new work, Biking Where Black, looking at the disproportionate enforcement of cycling laws in Black and Latino communities in Chicago. So Jesus, I'll turn over to you.
All right, thank you, Alex. I appreciate that introduction. Let me just pause a moment to share my screen. Okay, and the admiration is mutual, Alex. Certainly, I appreciate your work, and we've worked together on some projects related to mobility justice. And Miriam and I have worked on things together, so it's great to be with you today. I did tell Alex a condition of my speaking here with you virtually was that he would invite me back sometime to join you in person. So I'm looking forward to that sometime. So as Alex mentioned at the start, I'm going to be talking about my recently published study, Biking Where Black, Connecting Transportation Planning and Infrastructure to Disproportionate Policing. And I want to start by kind of framing the problem of mobility injustice, looking at traffic safety as the organizing framework. And then I'll talk about the specifics of this study in Chicago, which is the case here. Talk about implications for practice, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So I'm going to turn subtitles on here too, so hopefully the auto translation will work well. So as I mentioned, this study was recently published. It's in Transportation Research Part D, if you have a chance, take a look at it. But what is quite exciting about this is it's got a lot of media coverage once it came out. The project was co-generated with an organization in Chicago called Equiticity, that they describe themselves as a racial equity movement. And they do a lot of work around sort of cycling and micromobility in primarily Black communities in Chicago. And this work came out of questions about Chicago's safety policy, which I'll get into in a little bit more. And so when the study came out, they sent it out to their networks, and the media coverage of this shows that this is really a very important issue to the general public. It's very salient in our kind of current day discussions about racial equity in transportation. And it has sparked some policy conversations that I'll get to a little bit later. So for those of you who are on the academic track, there's proof that this work can get out there in policy. So let me start a little bit with the background about traffic safety trends and policy directions, and some of the research background that has motivated this study. So for those of you who follow transportation discussions, it is not unfair to say that we have a safety epidemic on the streets. Traffic fatalities, pedestrian and cyclist fatalities in particular, have increased over the last decade, while vehicle deaths have declined or remain generally flat. Vehicle technology has made it safer to ride in a car as a passenger, but a combination of distractions and an inability to implement or an inattention to implement changes in street design has made it worse for pedestrians and cyclists. So if we look at the pedestrian fatalities on the right, the low point was actually the year before this chart starts in 2009 with 4,100 pedestrian fatalities. So there's been an increase of 51% in pedestrians who have died in traffic crashes over the decade. On the left, cycling, not quite as dramatic, but still a 36% increase in deaths for cyclists over the decade. And the trends for 2020 look even worse. The Governor's Highway Safety Association came out with a report earlier this year that estimates 6,700 pedestrian fatalities in 2020. So a 63% increase since 2009. We want to pair those numbers though with changes in travel to understand what the extent of the problem is. And so this graphic shows from Smart Growth America in their Dangerous by Design report, which tracks the trends in pedestrian and roadway safety every 2 years, shows that over this period, while pedestrian deaths increased by a share of 35%, so the data is a little bit older, VMT, vehicle miles traveled, increased by 8%, but walking only as a share of all trips only increased by 1%, and traffic deaths here show a decline. So again, pointing out that this increase in pedestrian and cyclist fatalities is not associated with a commensurate increase in travel by car or walking or cycling, which this image doesn't show. The book Right of Way by Angie Schmidt is an excellent dive into the context and problems with pedestrian safety. So I would recommend reading that. We can drill down a little bit more into these fatality statistics to understand what the differences are across demographic groups. And this image here is showing fatalities by race ethnicity. And we find significant disparities in terms of who is being killed. So the grouping on the left are the pedestrian fatalities, the grouping on the right are the bicycle fatalities. And the way to interpret this chart is the blue bar in each of the clusters on the very left indicates the share of that group in the population who died in that mode. So 19 Black pedestrians made up 19% of pedestrian fatalities over this period of time from 2014 to 2018, yet only made up 12% of the population, which is the next bar in the cluster, 11% of miles traveled, miles walked, and 13% of trips taken. The same is true for cycling here. If you look at the grouping on the right, 14% of cyclists who died were Black, who only, again, make up 12% of the population, but only traveled 4% of the miles by bicycle, the total miles by bicycle in the country, and 6% of the trips taken. So this tells us what the trends are. It doesn't tell us why the trends are happening, but we can point to other research that shows greater deficiencies in infrastructure in Black and brown neighborhoods, fewer bike lanes, poor sidewalk quality, more high-speed roads. Generally, the conditions that lead to these inequities are inequitable themselves. Austin is no different. So Vision Zero Austin published an ArcGIS story map that tells the story of pedestrian and cyclist roadway safety in the city. And I can point here to the Black and African American population. This shows the ratio of people killed by that mode compared to their race, to their share in the population. And so pedestrians are overrepresented by, Black pedestrians are overrepresented by more than twice compared to their share in the population. Cyclists, 1.6, and motor vehicles significantly higher than any other group in these data. A lot of this data analysis is coming out of a safety framework known as Vision Zero that I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. But one of the good things about this is this framework is that it has caused transportation departments, planning agencies to take a deep dive into the safety concerns with taking a racial equity perspective on them. So I'm showing the analyses from 3 different cities here to demonstrate that not only are there patterns by demographic groups, but they're also spatially manifest. Los Angeles, the city on the left, the red lines indicate the high injury network streets, which are the streets with the highest share of serious injuries and fatalities in the city. And the blue areas, the darker blue indicates worse on a dimension of burden. And in this case, they're defining burden as poor health outcomes, economic burdens, and then other vulnerable populations like female-headed households, people of color, low-income folks, zero-car households, those sorts of things. So in Los Angeles, nearly half of the high injury network streets are in these communities burdened with the poorest health outcomes and economic conditions. The map in the middle is San Francisco. Again, the orange, yellow areas here indicate communities of concern, defined similarly to Los Angeles. So in San Francisco, 75% of the severe and fatal injuries occur on just 13% of the streets. 31% of the total street length are in communities of concern, but 50% of the high injury network is in those same communities. In Chicago, the image on the right, I don't have a similar overlay of demographics, but the high crash corridors and high crash areas are indicated here on the maps. And as I'll show later with the demographics of the city, the southern part here, the western part of the city here are predominantly African-American. And so you can see just a visual inspection shows that most of these locations are in those communities of color. So we have the safety epidemic. We have evidence of significant racial disparities in outcomes with respect to safety. And part of this, and some other conversations have prompted some changes in the way that we think about how to address the safety problem. So safety has been traditionally viewed as a problem of driver error. So drivers are going to do what they're going to do. So we want to make the road system very forgiving of their mistakes. And so that if you think about driving along the interstate highway, you have wide lanes, you have a significant clear zone from the edge of the roadway to any other object that you can hit. And all of that is meant to sort of help the driver survive crashes at interstate highway speeds. But essentially that same perspective has been traditionally applied to city roads, where it may not actually make sense and lead to the problems we're seeing with vulnerable road users. So there's been an emphasis on engineering, but again, geared towards the car. There's been an emphasis on education and an emphasis on enforcement, where we've seen seatbelt enforcement, DUI campaigns have been really effective in eliminating deaths due to those causes. But some of the new problems like driver distractions, which are illegal in many places, have not, the effectiveness of enforcement hasn't really worked. So it calls into question these old principles and what the new way of thinking about safety is one of a safe system, where we're not just trying to protect the driver, but we want to tolerate driver mistakes, but in a way where designers of the street and planners have some responsibility in those mistakes. Essentially, making sure that those mistakes aren't deadly for everyone. People will make mistakes, but the solution is to design a system to account for that human vulnerability. Essentially, it means getting our city streets down to the lowest speed possible. Other elements of safe system include those same kind of 3 E's of approach to safety, but in different ways. So so education is still in there, but there's a use of data to drive targeted interventions, and some changes in thinking about traffic enforcement, but I'll come back to that later. In the United States, this has been implemented as Vision Zero, which Chicago was one of the first cities that adopted a Vision Zero plan, but now over 40 cities in the US have this policy. And the goal with Vision Zero is to get traffic fatalities down to 0. But as you can see in this image of safe systems on the right, road rules and enforcement is still a component of the safe systems approach, even though it's not sort of emphasized at the same level that it might have been previously. But the consequences of this continued enforcement, or enforcement as a continued part of the safe systems, brings up questions of racial equity. So what do I mean by that? If you take a look at recent media around racial disparities in traffic enforcement, you will find a lot. And I'm going to focus here on pedestrian and walking and cycling for a moment. But again, there's evidence of racial disparities across all of these enforcement tools. Now, these laws are generally implemented or generally first introduced with the idea that they're going to improve safety of roadway users. So jaywalking, the history of jaywalking is Peter Norton in Fighting Traffic really chronicles the sort of invention of jaywalking well at the behest of automakers trying to get drive on clear streets out of the way of pedestrians. But nevertheless, there's ostensibly a safety element here to protect pedestrians from vehicles. And yet, if we look around the country, San Diego, 16% of all jaywalking citations in San Diego between 2015 and 2021 were issued to Black people, who only make up 6% of the city population. In Los Angeles, a third of pedestrians were issued jaywalking tickets over the last decade. That third were Black in a city where only 9% of the population is Black. In an audit of the New York City Police Department in 2019, found that 90% of illegal or unsafe crossing tickets were issued to Black and Latino pedestrians, even though they only make 55% of the population in New York City. Jacksonville, Florida, Black residents received 78% of all jaywalking tickets, despite only 29% of the city's population. We could look at cycling, which is what I'll do here in a moment. And in Tampa, Tampa police issued 2,500 bike tickets in a 3-year period, which is more than any of the other large cities combined. But 8 out of 10 of those tickets were issued to Black residents. And recently in Seattle, there's been conversations about repealing a bicycle helmet law. Seattle is one of the only cities in the United States that requires adults over 18 to wear a helmet. An analysis of almost 1,700 helmet citations issued between 2003 and 2020 found that Black cyclists received helmet infractions at a rate nearly 4 times higher than white cyclists. And Native American and Alaska Native cyclists were cited at a rate more than twice white cyclists. So in many instances, even though these laws have been are on the books as a safety mechanism, they are often used as pretexts to stop particularly Black and brown folks who the police are trying to profile for other reasons. So all of this background sort of leads to the way that I think about transportation planning, transportation policies, and the way that people travel. And I use the data in the background to illustrate how deeply the choices or the lack of choice that people make and have about travel are predicted by race because of these policies that are that have been racist, explicitly racist in the past, and have racist outcomes today, and how those policies have also shaped the built environment in a way that's disproportionately harmed low-income people of color. So those of us who study travel behavior kind of point to the immediate factors as influences of the choices that people make. So individual factors, how much money you have, or whether you have a car, your attitudes and your perceptions, so whether you feel safe walking or cycling at night, for example, is going to predict whether or not you're going to do that. The social environment, so what people around you think about taking that mode. So here in Davis, where cycling rates are something like 30%, it's super easy to get on a bike and ride around. And then, of course, the physical and built environment where planners have most of their ability to make interventions. If you have a built environment that's built for cycling, more people are going to do that. So that all leads to travel behavior, but we can't get away from the fact that all of this is embedded in these policies and regulations that I talked about, which again is shaped by the race and racism that's been present in the United States. So in other words, when we try to make interventions in any of these spaces to get people to get on a bicycle and ride, or to be safer on that bicycle and riding, we can't ignore how race is central to that distribution of interventions and those perceptions of safety. So I think this points to the mobility justice framework is really helpful in thinking about the way to think about these problems, but also the way to offer solutions to those problems, and really focusing on how identity influences vulnerability. On the academic side, Mimi Scheller has sort of brought this way of thinking to light about how we need to understand not just the distribution of bike lanes, for example, or the access to power that people have, but the way that we are sort of a mobile society and how that sort of influences the way that the sort of policies affect us and the way we should think about them. The untokening network on the practitioner side, which is a network of people of color who are in transportation planning and advocacy groups, have really brought these developed principles that sort of call on us to acknowledge how identity is part of the choices and constraints that people have around travel, about how we need to acknowledge and seek to repair the harm that we've done via planning and policies, and how we need to value community experiences as part of the data and knowledge about ways forward. And in some work that I've done with Alex, we kind of point to other domains like education, where these issues are tied together. And it also forces us to think about, again, identity as, for example, in gendered and intersectional violence in transportation systems, and how those constrain travel. So when we get to the specifics of the study that I'm talking about today, one of the things that we're interested in is how this policy of Vision Zero in Chicago in particular, but kind of more broadly, how safety policy, what are the unintended consequences in this policy, and how has transportation planning and infrastructure compounded racial inequities in policing? And I've already showed how that's connected a little bit, and we'll show that specifically with Chicago in a moment. So in some of the background research that I laid out the context of kind of the safety epidemic and how mobility justice helps us think about this problem. But let me turn now specifically to some of the research that helped guide this study, and talk about how people respond to these deficiencies in the built environment. So what we can say from the research is that really illegal behaviors, quote unquote illegal behaviors, are often, when we're talking about cycling specifically, are often rational responses to deficiencies in planning to a transportation system that is not built for cyclists. In places where it's illegal to ride a bike on the sidewalk, most cyclist citations are given for riding on the sidewalk. And in New York City, it's the third most common summons issued in the city, behind alcohol consumption in the street and disorderly conduct. In the city of Chicago, cycling on the sidewalk makes up 90% of citations, but people bicycle on the 90% of bicycle citations, but people bicycle on the sidewalk because they prefer to be separated from traffic. The more separation from traffic, so when we get from a painted bike lane to a buffered bike lane, which is a bike lane with some extra space on the side, to something like a cycle track, which has a physical barrier between the bike lane and the general traffic lane, people prefer that higher degree of separation more. But cyclists will ride on the sidewalk along high traffic roads when there's no other infrastructure. And the people who tend to be sidewalk riders are generally more timid or less experienced than people who might feel safe riding in the street. Again, that's this rational, I talk about it as a rational response, is because cyclists indicate when they, in surveys, when they ride on the sidewalk or when they break a rule, they do it most commonly for reasons of personal safety. So in a global study of people who use transportation, those who identified as cyclists, so almost 18,000 people, 71% of them said they broke rules for a personal safety reason, and this was the most common reason given. In a smaller study in Montreal, when the researchers gave a set of 4 hypothetical scenarios, cyclists would choose to break a traffic rule when they felt it was safer than precisely following the vehicle code. Going back to that large study, that large global study, something like 97% of respondents indicated that they had broken a traffic rule at some point. So one question that all of this raises is whether policing is the right way to intervene for safety purposes. If people are going to ride on the sidewalk because they feel unsafe, is it really that dangerous that we should be policing that practice? And there's some evidence that shows that riding on the sidewalk does seem to be riskier. A review of 23 studies on cycling safety estimates that the risk of collisions while riding on the sidewalk is something like 2 to 16 times that of riding in the road. And it depends on what kind of riding or comparison that you're talking about. So if it's more dangerous than riding against traffic, sort of riding the wrong way, but just as dangerous as riding on mixed use paths with pedestrians, where it's sort of explicitly encouraged to bicycle and walk in the same space. Part of the reason for the danger is, of course, interactions with pedestrians, so it's dangerous for pedestrians, but part of the reason it's dangerous is because of those intersections with driveways that would cross the sidewalk. But the problem is, again, the consequences of these interventions with respect to traffic policing. Traffic policing has been shown to be disparate, racist, and unjust. Traffic stops are the most common form of interaction between police and the public. and a wealth of evidence shows that there are persistent disparities in stops, in tickets, in arrests, and searches for Black people compared to other groups. And on that searches point, no evidence of higher amounts or more contraband to be found in those searches. So there's been a number of studies looking at millions and millions of vehicle stops, and both some work out of North Carolina that shows pervasive racial disparities in departments of all sizes. A study out of Stanford using 100 million traffic stops showing, again, Black drivers are stopped more often per capita than white drivers. But when you account for time of day, so when you look at those stops during nighttime periods when you can't actually see the driver, you see those disparities decline or be eliminated, showing or providing strong evidence, or at least a very strong suggestion of racial profiling going on here. The other thing to note is that discretionary stops, like bike ticketing, like someone being stopped for having a taillight out, that is not a safety violation in and of itself, tends to drive that bias in traffic enforcement when there's been work that's shown when police departments switch their tactics to focusing only on the most dangerous behaviors. So things like running stop signs or speeding, those racial disparities are eliminated in traffic stops. So again, just to reemphasize that when the stop is not for explicit safety reasons, we see more racial profiling, and that's because police departments generally admit to using traffic stops as a pretext for trying to find contraband or other reasons. So all of this goes back to this Vision Zero program in Chicago, which is kind of the emphasis of this study, and police engagement is a central component to that Vision Zero plan. It came out in Chicago in 2017. The city identified high crash corridors and neighborhoods that I showed earlier, and focuses on these better engineering and data analysis, but also has a strong emphasis on enforcement. And the quote here is that police will enforce traffic laws fairly, focusing on the most dangerous driving behaviors. And so they see police engagement as part of the changing culture of safety, but advocacy groups have asked whether this is actually something that's going to pan out. This focus on engagement, on police engagement, has been shifting in the last year, particularly after the events, the George Floyd murder and the racial, the reawakening to issues of racial injustice. And some cities have actually removed traffic enforcement from the police, or at least considering it. I'll come back to that a little bit more later. So what are we doing? What did we do in this study? I was interested in the extent to which planning, or in this case, manifest by infrastructure, was really tied to issues of over-policing that was already occurring. So I wanted to know what influenced the number of tickets, bicycle tickets issued by per street segment, accounting for the characteristics of the street and the composition and context of the neighborhood. I'm happy to talk about the specifics of the modeling, but I don't want to focus on that. I'll just kind of focus broadly on the methods and results. So to get this data, we issued a Freedom of Information Act request to the Chicago Police Department for all of the tickets issued for bicycle-related offenses. And we're looking at the time period between 2017 and 2019. We did request older data from 2014, and I'll show some kind of trends based on that. But the analysis is focused on this more recent time because that's where we have the other kinds of data that we need to answer this question. As I mentioned previously, 90% of all of the cycling tickets in the city of Chicago are issued for riding a bike on the sidewalk. And so we're only focused on those kinds of tickets because that kind of offense, again, can be directly related to the presence or absence of infrastructure in that behavioral response where people want to feel safer. We looked at the neighborhood sociodemographics, the street segment characteristics, so whether and what kind of bike infrastructure was on the street, the functional class of the street, so whether it was an arterial high traffic kind of road or a local street, kind of a neighborhood street with low levels of traffic, and the number of cyclists who were on the street using data from the Strava Metro service, which has its own problems, but we'll sort of hand wave over that and can talk about that in the discussion if you want. We also have some additional data on the neighborhood context. So how much policing is present in the neighborhood. And then because in theory, these policing practices should be associated with levels of safety, we also bring in serious and fatal crashes to control for those factors. Most of this stuff we measured at the neighborhood level, although we do have those street segment characteristics at the street level. One thing to note here is that the data do not include identifiers about the person being stopped. We are only able to say about where they are stopped. And so that's why the title of this talk is not biking while Black, but biking where Black, because we only have those neighborhood characteristics. All right, so in the city of Chicago, the trend is sort of hopeful over time in terms of the number of citations issued per year. We had a high of almost 4,000 issued in 2014, and it's declined to 2019, 1,343 tickets. Part of the reason that we think this decline occurred is because in 2017, a negotiated agreement between the American Civil Liberties Union and the Chicago Police Department was implemented, in which the department was required to collect and report more transparently and would train officers on correct legal conditions for investigatory stops. So what's known elsewhere as stop and frisk. That agreement became effective in 2017. And so we think that additional data transparency and attentiveness to policing practices probably led to fewer stops for riding on the sidewalk. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the city of Chicago, it is a city of 2.7 million people. The racial demographics are roughly split between Black, white, and Latino, about a third each. Although there's been a Black exodus of late for kind of the inner ring suburbs. So the Black population has been declining and is a smaller share than it once was even a decade ago. It is a starkly segregated city. Depending on how you count, it is the fifth most segregated city in the United States. And I want to focus or draw your attention to these two particular neighborhoods that I have in circles here. These are the predominantly Black neighborhoods in the city. And that's important for the data I'm going to show you on the next slide. So when we look at the distribution of where those cycling tickets were issued in the city of Chicago, again, highlighting those two circled areas, which are the predominantly Black neighborhoods, we see that's where most of the tickets are issued. So on average, there were about 6 tickets per 1,000 people issued in majority Black census tracts, about 1.9 per 1,000 in majority Latino census tracts, and less than 1 per 1,000 in majority white tracts. Those relationships held true when we were controlling for infrastructure, for cycling volume, for neighborhood context as well. We can look at the map in the middle. Again, those same neighborhood areas are highlighted, and this map is showing where the bike injury crashes occur in the city of Chicago. And we can see that they're mostly along this corridor here, which is Milwaukee Avenue, otherwise known as the Hipster Highway, because it's goes from a largely gentrified area out here near Wicker Park to downtown. And lots of bike injury crashes sort of in the north part of the city, and some at the edge of this neighborhood, but not really enough to show that association with the location of the citations issued. And then if we look at infrastructure, which is that image on the right here, where bike lanes are located in the city, we see a notable absence from the west and south sides of the city, where Black people make up the majority or plurality of the population in the census tract. They have about 9%, 6% of the street lanes have bike infrastructure compared to white neighborhoods where 9% of the street lanes have bike infrastructure. So I wanted to take a look more closely at how these rates of tickets are associated with characteristics of the street segment. And so what this image is showing are the incident rate of tickets issued per street segment by street classification, by the type of bike facility on them. So I'll draw your attention here to the arterial streets. So in general, arterial streets, so those are the high traffic streets, are the most likely to get tickets. They're the streets where people are most likely to get tickets for riding a bike on the sidewalk. And this makes intuitive sense because there's a lot of traffic, and if you're riding on this street, you're going to want to get as far away from that traffic as possible. And we can see that the bike infrastructure on these streets here helps decrease that rate of getting tickets. So on an arterial street, you're about 15 times more likely to get a ticket than on a local street. But when there are bike facilities, you're still more likely to get a ticket here, but less likely than if there was no bike infrastructure. We see a similar pattern here for collector streets, which are still more traffic than local, but less than arterial streets. And again, this better bike infrastructure. So bike routes are those that basically have signs or street markings, but don't have separated lanes. But when that infrastructure is higher quality, you see a decrease in the number of tickets. And then local streets is kind of funny to look at because there's low traffic anyway. So this might be a reflection of just more cyclists on the street overall. But what this points to is the potential effectiveness in infrastructure in getting people to ride on the street versus riding on the sidewalk. When we looked at the neighborhood context, so the characteristics of bike crashes and the number of crimes per census tract and the number of officers assigned, we don't see very strong relationships with the number of tickets issued per segment. In fact, there was no relationship at all with the number of bike crashes and the number of tickets issued in along those street segments. And there was a negative relationship. So when there were fewer serious crashes of all modes, there were more tickets issued along those street segments. We did see a positive relationship between the number of crimes in the neighborhood and tickets being issued, which could reflect increased police presence. Although the number of officers assigned to the precinct was not a significant predictor of the number of tickets. So when we put it all together and look at these relationships between race and infrastructure, we see a significant effect of that separated infrastructure would have on the number of tickets issued in primarily Black and Latino neighborhoods. So these charts are showing sort of the predictive effects of the model. So the predicted number of tickets per segment based on the share of the population that is either Black on the top or Latino on the bottom, and how that type of bike infrastructure would reduce the number of tickets. So looking kind of globally, if there were separated bike infrastructure on these arterial streets or the collector streets that had the most tickets issued on them, we would see a global reduction by about 8% of the number of tickets issued in majority Black neighborhoods. So that's going from something like 4,000 tickets to 3,700 tickets. So we're not talking like super earth-shattering numbers, but we are showing a reduction just based on the availability of infrastructure alone. And that's without kind of digging into policing practices. So kind of the biggest takeaway here from this study is really, I'm showing you evidence that transportation planning and the programming of infrastructure is intertwined with unjust policing practices. There was most of the tickets, most of the cycling tickets were issued in Black neighborhoods, but that street infrastructure lowered the incidence of tickets, particularly on busy streets. But that infrastructure was disproportionately absent from Black and Latino neighborhoods, which is why we see that increase or that decrease, such a sharp decrease, that the effect that infrastructure would have on tickets in those neighborhoods. So people are likely riding that sidewalk because they don't have that infrastructure. They feel unsafe on the streets. Another clear point here is issues of safety are not linked to issues of enforcement using the data and the models that I have here. And this is corroborated by statements from the Chicago Police Department itself, which acknowledge that pulling people over on the sidewalk is often used as a crime prevention strategy. And there are kind of official crime prevention strategies that use traffic stops as pretextual stops for crime prevention. So the point here is that there's a compounding level that these inequities sort of compound other inequities. So the planning and the programming and the investment, this lack of infrastructure compounds other inequities that are already present in policing practices. And it's important to recognize that we sort of need to work across boundaries to remedy these failures. So what can planners and policymakers do? Well, the very first thing is to reconsider what the role of enforcement is in traffic safety. Should police departments be using traffic stops as a pretext for crime prevention, or should traffic enforcement be dedicated only to the most dangerous incidents? Should armed police be conducting traffic stops at all, or should that be removed to either an unarmed police force or a civilian police force? And advocacy efforts right now, based on this work and years of previous advocacy in other venues, are focused on this task. And there have been meetings with the mayor's office to rethink how enforcement, particularly in Vision Zero, is being thought of. Many cities around the country are grappling with this problem, as I mentioned before. So the city of Berkeley, California, has officially made a policy that traffic enforcement will be removed from the police, but the question of how to implement it has not been figured out yet. Other cities are talking about degrees of reforming traffic enforcement: Cambridge, Massachusetts, Los Angeles, Washington, DC. The work also shows the importance of investing in infrastructure. It is clear on how, at least by the evidence of sidewalk tickets, that presence of infrastructure can get people to feel safer riding on the streets, where it might be safer for them anyway with protected infrastructure. But this needs to be done in close collaboration with community members, given significant concerns with the link between cycling and gentrification. Whether or not it's true in fact, it's often true in lived experiences and perceptions. And so that work needs to be done with communities. And of course, sort of drawing back to these ideas in mobility justice, being attentive to intersections of identity and mobility is important. And so we need to recognize that needs differ across groups, that identity can influence behavior, and we need to recognize who we're planning with and who we're planning for to account for these differing needs in order to bring justice to the streets. So I am going to stop here, and I'm looking forward to discussion.
Thanks so much, Jesus. That was great. It was exciting to see you present it. Let's take some questions. Are there any questions from the audience? You can feel free to unmute and ask away or raise your hand, and I'll kind of moderate. I see Jake popping up here. Hey, Jake, do you have a question, or do you want to jump in?
Yeah. First of all, great to see you, Jesus. Congratulations on your move to UC Davis, and really fascinated to learn about your research. Do you have any, I know this is a little bit beyond the scope of your study, but do you have any hunches or just suppositions about why the drop with separated bike lanes wasn't bigger? Like, do you think, are people still riding on the sidewalks even in cases where there are protected bike lanes? I mean, what's your sort of hunch about what's going on there?
Yeah, so it's great to see you too, Jake. And I'm not exactly sure why we're still seeing that sidewalk riding behavior. It does to me. I mean, it could be a couple of things. One, it could be that people still don't feel safe enough on this kind of infrastructure, except around kind of the core areas of downtown Chicago. It's the infrastructure is pretty grim based on my perspective. So it could be that the streets themselves are not great, but it could also be the lingering effects of pretextual stops. It could be people who are perhaps riding on the separated lanes, getting off on the sidewalk to go to a house or the store or something, and getting stopped while they're sort of in that transition point. Those are my hunches, but I'm not really, I don't have the evidence to say why in particular the difference wasn't greater.
Matthew, do you have a question, or did you just turn on your video?
I mostly thought it'd just be nice to turn on my video.
Okay, great. Yeah, folks can feel free to turn on video for Q&A too.
I appreciate not speaking into the void. Thank you.
Yeah,
sure.
it's the Zoom fatigue is real. Shu, you have a question?
Yeah, first I want to say that Matthew looks great. I'm happy he turned his video on. But I was wondering if you or any Dr. Wegman or Dr. Carner or Dr. Solis have any thoughts on this in the context of Austin, and if any of y'all have done any research, I guess, about whether this kind of biking wear black, this kind of concept has come up in Austin, and also in terms of the infrastructure, I guess kind of on the east side and on the Eastern Crescent compared to elsewhere in the city.
I don't. I guess I'm the one who might, and I don't. I suspect that the broader context of cycling in Austin is a little bit different from Chicago. In general, I suspect that there's more cycling going on in Chicago than there is in Austin. But I suspect, just knowing what we know about policing and disproportionate enforcement, I suspect there would be similar patterns in most US cities where there's some amount of cycling going on, but I'm not sure. And I mean, one thing that I wanted to ask Jesus that is kind of related is just about the data and the process of getting access to those ticket data from the FOIA request, because like it would be cool, Shu, to do a study in Austin, but we would have to jump through some hoops, I'm sure, to get information. Although Austin does have, I think, better open data policies than most. I'm not sure how easily accessible their citations, citation information is. But when they gave you the data, Jesus, like, can you just talk about that process? Like, was it difficult? Did you have to pay? How did the data come? Like, did they just dump like these banker boxes filled with tickets that you had to code, or were they digitized? I'd be curious to hear about that.
Yeah, it's compared to other colleagues who have conducted FOIA requests, it actually was a quite painless process, relatively painless, which was very surprising for what I know about Chicago. So we did, and actually I had conversations with the analysts in the police department to begin with, and we were, he was almost willing to kind of provide the data without the FOIA request, but he found that he thought it would be better to go through the official channels to keep track of it. So we issued the FOIA request, and we said, basically, we want all the bike and we also requested pedestrian tickets. We want all of this stuff. And they responded within the legally required time period, which was 5 days, 3 or 5 days, I don't remember, and said no. But if you make your request more specific, then yes, we can do it. And so we had to identify the particular statutes in Chicago Municipal Code and Illinois Vehicle Code that we were interested in getting the tickets for. And so when we did that specific request, they responded within the legal time period, and then the next week gave us spreadsheets of all of the data. Now, based on what we know about the ACLU agreement, they are supposed to be collecting data on race of the individuals, but they said that they did not, and said that they could not provide that to us. So there was still like some limits to the data, but we were generally pleased with the response that we got.
That seems weird because in the FARS records, for example, cops do report on race.
Yeah, it does seem weird, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It does seem weird. Yeah, I had a conversation with an Uber executive one time, and she was making the argument that they didn't want to collect race about their passengers, information about race of their passengers, because it would be invasive or invading their privacy. And I was like, well, if obviously if you don't collect data on race, then you can't do any kind of analysis by race. You can't find evidence of discrimination. She promptly stopped talking to me after that. But so presumably there's something similar to that going on.
Yeah.
Do other folks have questions? I have a bunch that I could throw out, but I want to make sure that other people have a chance to ask.
Sorry, you can go ahead, Zoe.
Thank you, Matthew. This is sort of an aside, but from what I've been seeing in Austin, a lot of the bike lanes in my own neighborhood have been transformed to that sort of split sidewalk method. So instead of having a specific protected bike lane, they're kind of bringing bikers onto a sidewalk and trying to split it with walking traffic. I was curious if you'd seen in your research some sort of effect on either biker safety or walking safety, or kind of how those types of bike lanes might be performing differently.
Yeah, it's there aren't a ton of them, and they're confusing for cyclists because, like, normally a sidewalk is the place you're not supposed to be, but when you are supposed to be there, like, well, how would you know that? So I don't have data on how they affect folks or behaviors or anything related to citations, other than to say, sort of, I'm opining here that it's kind of a cheap way out into building actual infrastructure that would serve everyone better.
Matthew, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks. So I am coming from living in the New York area for the past about 7 years. And I have been thinking a lot lately about the kind of racial dynamics of food delivery in New York City, and I imagine in a lot of other cities. That primarily happens by bike. And I don't have a fully formed question, but it's something along the lines of, do you have thoughts on or any like narrowed down insights on the kind of like on the job danger, like crashes or citations or different things like that? I know like those food delivery service folks make pretty minimal margins to make it worth their time. And so like a single citation and a fee, if their employer doesn't cover it, could like break the bank for them. And if they get in a crash, their bike is broken. Like there's just so many different moments where it's bad. And then I'm just thinking about like, typically this is at the service of wealthier white people in the city. And there's just like so many layers to that.
Yeah. So I don't have data specifically on this, but Do Lee, who's a professor at CUNY, has done some amazing work on food delivery cyclists in New York City. And he kind of points out the disproportionate impacts on food delivery workers. And at first it was sort of e-bikes and moped type devices were illegal in New York. And so they were getting fined and cited for that, and no helmets and all that kind of stuff. And you're exactly right; they're losing wages for these laws, and sort of it's an environmental justice concern where these folks are, again, you're right, serving wealthier folks, but bearing the brunt of the burdens. So I would point you to his work. I don't know that he's actually looked at safety concerns, but definitely the enforcement policing concerns he has. It is a very kind of New York problem, though, because the scale and scope of food delivery services are not as they are in most other places.
If you've ever ridden a bike in downtown Manhattan, holy cow, it's just a different level of respect for those riders. It's terrifying.
Yeah.
If you had if you had data on the race of the person who received the citation, then you could look at this. You could look at who's getting cited in majority white neighborhoods potentially and kind of speak to that, but you don't have those data. Yeah. So I think Miriam, you've got your hand up. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, and I'll apologize in advance. I have to go to a research interview in a few minutes. Jesus, one of the things that you talked about is your research design process and how you work with an organization to develop this particular project. And I know you talked about the growing body of literature that addresses the intersection of transportation, bicycling, racial justice, and environmental justice. Can you, and I know that you've worked with multiple organizations on these issues, both in California, in Illinois, possibly other states. How do you see the kind of organizational landscape of advocacy changing? And I think that this may be good for some of our students really interested in working not only at the city level, but with organizations leading these organizations in their urban contexts.
Yeah. So I think thinking about kind of transportation focusing on the transportation space, I think there has been a renewed focus on racial equity in transportation. Maybe it's not renewed, maybe it's just new. And part of this is driven by last summer's kind of racial reawakening. And part of it is driven by policies at the federal level in the Biden administration that is emphasizing racial justice as part of federal policy and not just transportation, but all federal agencies. So what that means is that folks who have been working in advocacy for a long, long time, because it's like work on racial justice and transportation is not new. It's just the attention to it at the policy level is newer, are gaining a little bit more cachet, I would say, with policymakers about the expertise and the knowledge and the resources that they bring to the table. And so I've seen more advocacy groups being invited to the table. I've seen folks who have been former advocates being employed in positions in departments of transportation and other agencies to lead efforts around equity and justice. There is more attention to paying advocates for their time in consulting on issues of racial equity in transportation. And there's still some bureaucracy to get over, but agencies are starting to do that more. And then on the research side, I think the research community in transportation that has been traditionally dominated by engineering is recognizing more the value of partnering with these kinds of organizations to do this sort of impactful research. So there's a lot of work to be done, but I've kind of, in just the short 6 or 7 years that I've really been working on this, I've seen quite a bit of change towards this sort of mode of thinking.
I've got a question that kind of goes back to the specific paper, Jesus.
Yeah.
So it seemed like the results, the figure that Jake asked about first, that showed kind of small differences and maybe some effect of having separated facilities reducing the number of citations. So it seems like you have some evidence that better infrastructure leads to fewer one-on-one contacts with police.
Yep.
And we know like those are the types of things that we want to avoid because they can kind of escalate and potentially end in death.
Yep.
I'm curious if you looked at those data. I think the slide that you showed was aggregate over your whole data set. I wonder if you split it out by race, if you would maybe show stronger effects. So maybe getting at Jake's initial point, like in white neighborhoods, does it lead to fewer citations, but in Black neighborhoods, it's more mixed? Maybe it's kind of getting muddled.
Yeah, well, I tried to do that with the
modeling.
With the modeling, and
Yeah.
so that's where that 8% number comes from. And you can see, I don't know if I can. Let me see if I can go back to this slide here. So you can like this. The top one we can just focus on the share of the Black population. So this is looking at in the model. If you increase the share of the Black population in the census tract, how is it affecting the number of tickets based on the infrastructure type? And so looking at the arterial streets, you can see kind of, this is per street segment. So I divided the road network into essentially blocks, the block faces. And so basically in 100% Black census tract, of which there are a couple of like 99% ones. So there are a few of these in Chicago. You would expect one bike ticket per segment on an arterial street. But if that had a separated bike lane on it, you would expect just over half a ticket per street segment. So I tried to do that a little bit by the modeling here to show kind of the effect based on the population. Again, I think it would be a great analysis to do, but because I don't have information on the individual, we're starting to get into like ecological fallacy territory when we do that.
So I guess, a follow-up question, and this is one that I've been asked sometimes, and I feel like it's kind of unfair, but I'm going to put it to you. Which is, if we think, it does seem like based on your modeling results, if you've got better infrastructure, you have fewer interactions with police per capita.
Yeah.
But we know from research in other locations, the stuff that I'm thinking about, I think is mostly in Portland, where bicycle lanes are seen as a precursor of neighborhood change and gentrification and displacement.
Yep.
And so folks in principle don't want bike lanes in their neighborhoods. And I feel like that's a reasonable reaction to a history of trauma and injustice and being ignored in other planning processes. Destiny Thomas has talked a lot about this in the response to COVID and the rollout of slow streets being like happening overnight in to cater to the needs of wealthier, whiter folks who are now stuck at home, whereas the needs of Black communities over decades have been ignored. And Black folks have actually their lives have been ruined because of infrastructure. So it seems like a sensible response. So how do we, I mean, what do we do about that? Like, we want to have better infrastructure in these communities so folks can cycle safely. We certainly don't want to have gentrification and displacement. And we want to kind of redress a history of trauma, which is a tall order for planners to do. But I wonder if you've thought about that.
Yeah. I have thought about it, and I think so. The answer goes back to the point I made earlier, in that like transportation planners can't just think about transportation. Like, these are all sort of intersecting problems, right? And so we have to, like, if the problem is housing prices go up near bike lanes, the answer isn't automatically don't install bike lanes. The answer is also work on housing policies, right? To like bring more housing and bring the cost of housing down. If the issue is bike lanes appear to be only for white people, the answer is, well, let's like stop and talk with the community first and figure out like what's behind that sentiment and how can we solve the problem that way. You brought up slow streets, and my favorite example of this is in Oakland, California, and Warren Logan, who was the policy director at transportation policy director at the mayor's office during the slow streets rollout in Oakland, talked about this, where they did the same thing. They were like, all right, closing all the streets down, and this is what we're going to do. And then in Black communities, they were like, what, this is not like, we got to get to the store and we got to go to work because we're still essential workers, and this closing the streets isn't working for us. So the city said, okay, we're gonna stop, and we're gonna have conversations with the residents in these neighborhoods and figure out like, why is this not working? And the answer was, well, they don't want safe streets to recreate. They need safe places to like still go to the convenience store and pick up the things they need, and they still need to go to work and that sort of thing. So I think it really pointed to the conversations that need to be had first before we say like, this is the thing that needs to be done. The work in Portland, so I'm familiar with Amy Loberto's work, who's a sociologist at Portland State, and she has kind of two contrasting examples of this. One in Portland where there was significant pushback on bike lanes going through a historically Black neighborhood. But then she has a positive example in Chicago, working in a predominantly Puerto Rican neighborhood, of how planners worked with folks in the community to bring the infrastructure, to bring bike infrastructure, but in a way that respected the community there. So I really think it goes back to like this issue of respect and conversation, and being willing to like do the listening first, not coming in with like the answers as the planner, and this is what we're going to do, and working with communities to make sure it serves their needs. So it's not like it makes the work tougher, right? But it's necessary work.
Yep, good planning work. Okay, great. Any other questions for Jesus before we let him go? Jesus, we'll definitely have you back in person. City Forum's going to in-person next semester. So hopefully, if we're all, things look good, we should be in person for the foreseeable future. So Thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. It was great to see new faces and great to see familiar faces too.
Perfect. Okay. And we'll see everybody back next semester for the spring semester City Forum. See you later.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.